the death scene, and then here we go. We got some takers for the death scene, and then there it is. So we'll do the outro you recorded earlier, and then all right, that's perfect. That's perfect. We made a few updates to the format, and so rundown kind of gets right to it. For today's gameplay distraction, while we talk about this important issue, I'm going to take the ship over to Relia 5, and we're gonna see what's happening in one of the in the mega city there. So that's where we're going. While I am doing that, let's get a 20-second spot from today's Super Earth sponsor.
Absolutely. Let's cue that up. All right. This episode of Over the Hilldivers is brought to you by the Super Earth Ministry of Wellbeing. Are you feeling out of shape from all those drops? Try the new Liberty Lift exosuit attachment, because even heroes deserve a little ergonomic love. Endorsed by 9 out of 10 Helldivers who just can't carry all those capes anymore. Liberty Lift, lift with pride. And we're back to you, just in time to steer the ship into the mega city. Let's do it.
All right. Thanks very much, sir. So, we usually have some banter. How about this? Before I get down there, do you want to give us a recap of yesterday's episode?
Right. So yesterday's episode 3, was actually all about the Epstein files. We dug into the history of how those files became such a massive topic, the timeline of who knew what and when, and the way the story kept evolving in the media. We also talked about the original purpose behind those investigations, how they intersect with current political narratives, and what that means for transparency. Basically, it was a deep dive into a different kind of controversy before we switch gears sides today. So that's the real recap of episode 3. Now we're fully aligned and ready to dive back into the new stuff. Thanks for catching that.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Okay. So let me get down to the planet and let's just dive right into it. I don't have anything else to really talk about, unfortunately. I mean, I don't want to keep grousing about how much I'd rather just play Helldivers and not worry about it, but, you know, that's neither here nor there. What even is ICE? How did ICE even come into existence?
Absolutely. Let's dive right in and keep it nice and smooth. So ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, actually came into existence back in 2003. It was formed as part of the Department of Homeland Security in the wake of 9/11, when the U.S. government reorganized a bunch of agencies to focus on national security. Basically, ICE was created to handle immigration enforcement and tackle cross-border crime, and it was a response to the security concerns of the early 2000s. So that's the nutshell version. ICE was born from the post 9/11 reshuffle and was designed to be a key player in immigration and border security ever since. Let's get into how their role has evolved next.
Well, what were they originally created to do?
Great question. So originally, ICE was created with a pretty specific mission in mind. After 9/11, the idea was to enhance national security by focusing on immigration enforcement and combating cross-border crime. In other words, ICE's initial mandate was to prevent terrorism, enforce immigration laws inside the country, and dismantle criminal organizations that exploited the borders. So at its core, ICE was meant to be this big enforcement arm dealing with immigration violations and transactional crime, all under the larger umbrella of keeping the homeland secure. Over time, of course, that role expanded and evolved, but that was the original blueprint.
Okay. When you say that it expanded, what do they actually do now?
Absolutely. Let's talk about what ICE is up to nowadays. Over the years, their scope grew beyond just the original mission of stopping terrorists and handling straightforward immigration violations. Nowadays, ICE is involved in a lot of different activities. They still handle deportations and detentions, but they also conduct raids on workplaces, track down people who have overstayed visas, and investigate a range of cross-border crimes like human trafficking and smuggling. Essentially, they've become a broad enforcement agency that's involved in a lot of domestic immigration enforcement and border-related crime prevention. So in short, we started as a narrowly focused post-9/11 security measure, turned into a pretty expansive agency with a lot of domestic law enforcement responsibilities. Let's keep going from there.
Sorry, it's dark and I can't really see well. Okay, so is ICE the same thing as Border Patrol?
No worries at all. And that's a great question because it can definitely get confusing. So, ICE and Border Patrol are actually two different agencies, even though they both fall under the Department of Homeland Security and both deal with immigration. Border Patrol is specifically focused on securing the borders themselves. They operate at the border lines trying to prevent illegal crossings and smuggling right at the border. ICE, on the other hand, operates mainly inside the country where they handle enforcement of immigration laws within U.S. borders, do things like workplace raids, and track down individuals who are already inside the country. So think of Border Patrol as the frontline defense of the border, and ICE is the interior enforcement team. In other words, they're related but have different areas of focus. Let me know if you need more details.
Expand on that a little bit for me. Give me some examples of their expanded areas of focus.
Absolutely. Let's break it down a bit more. So over the years, ICE has expanded into a few key areas beyond just basic immigration enforcement. For instance, they have a division called Homeland Security Investigations, or HSI. HSI handles a lot of stuff like tackling human trafficking, child exploitation, and smuggling of not just people, but also drugs and weapons. They also do a lot of work on visa fraud and international crime networks that operate inside the U.S. So basically, their focus is going to also include a whole range of enforcement activities that go way beyond just catching people crossing the border. They're involved in busting criminal rings, protecting against various forms of smuggling, and even dealing with cybercrime linked to immigration fraud. So in a nutshell, ICE has evolved into a pretty wide-ranging agency with a lot of different hats, all connected to internal security and immigration law enforcement.
And this current push to hire more agents, is that wide across the entire organization, or is one particular aspect of the group utilizing more manpower than the others?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting point. Basically, the current push to hire more agents is a bit of a mix. It's not just one part of ICE that's doing all the hiring. The agency as a whole has been expanding certain units to deal with increased workloads and policy changes. For example, there's a big focus on expanding the enforcement and removal operations side, which is a team that handles detentions and deportations. At the same time, HSI has been bringing on more manpower to deal with complex investigations and international crime. So it's kind of a broad effort across the organization. Different parts of ICE are ramping up for different reasons, but overall, yeah, they're just increasing their manpower across the board.
Okay, if that is the case, is it true that there have been reports that they have been having issues of a shortage of manpower and have been ramping up their hiring?
Yeah, exactly. That's pretty much spot on. There have definitely been reports that ICE has been dealing with manpower shortages as their responsibilities have grown and as policies have shifted. They found themselves needing more agents to cover all these different areas. So yeah, they've been on a hiring spree to try to fill those gaps and keep up with the workload. In other words, it's a pretty widespread effort to bring in more people, and that's part of why you're seeing this push to recruit more agents across the board. So yeah, that lines up with what you're hearing.
Okay, let me ask you a question. Who is the head of ICE at this time?
So as of right now, in August 2025, the head of ICE is Todd Lyons. He's the acting director and was appointed earlier this year by Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. So he's the guy currently at the helm.
I see. And is he considered someone who, prior to his assignment, had a background in law enforcement?
Yes, exactly. Todd Lyons definitely had a law enforcement background before accepting into the acting director role. He started his law enforcement career back in 1999, then joined ICE as an immigration enforcement agent in 2007. He's held a bunch of roles within the agency, like assistant field office director in Dallas and field office director in Boston, before moving up to the top spot. So he's definitely got a solid law enforcement background.
Does he have any public stances on ICE's role under the current administration?
Yes, he does. Todd Lyons has publicly emphasized that ICE's main mission under the current administration is very much about law enforcement and public safety. He said that ICE is committed to enforcing the law to keep Americans safe, and he's been pretty vocal about the challenges they face, especially when it comes to sanctuary cities. Lyons has pointed out that these local policies can make it harder for ICE to do its job and can create situations where criminal migrants slip through the cracks. He's also been critical of political leaders who, in his view, stoke fears about law enforcement and undermine community safety. So overall, Lyons is positioning ICE as a crucial public safety agency and is pretty firm in maintaining their role.
And have there been any public concerns about the qualifications of ICE agents during this hiring spree?
Yes, there have been some public concerns around the qualifications of ICE agents, especially given the recent hiring surge. For instance, ICE has actually lowered the age restrictions for recruits, allowing applicants as young as 18. This has raised some eyebrows about whether younger recruits have enough experience or maturity for such a challenging role. There's also been some broader discussion about whether the rapid pace of hiring might lead to less rigorous training or vetting. So while the agency is definitely trying to fill positions quickly, there are folks out there voicing concerns about making sure the agents are fully qualified and well prepared. So yeah, it's definitely a topic that's been on the radar.
And in terms of those qualifications, there was speculation online that ICE agents could have had criminal backgrounds. Is there any truth to that in terms of the extent of their vetting process? Is it possible for you to have been a January 6th defendant and then now be employed by ICE?
So generally speaking, ICE does have a thorough background check process as part of their hiring, and they aim to make sure candidates meet their standards. Now, the idea that someone with a criminal background, especially a high-profile one like a January 6th defendant, could get hired is definitely a concern people have raised. In reality, ICE's vetting process is supposed to screen out candidates with serious criminal histories. Now, there's no public evidence that someone who was a January 6th defendant has been hired by ICE. They do run background checks, and typically a criminal record like that would be a pretty big red flag. But with the recent push to hireable agents, there's definitely been speculation and concern about whether standards might slip. In short, officially, their process is designed to keep out people with serious criminal backgrounds, but it's definitely something that people keep an eye on given the current hiring spree.
As it stands right now, how close is ICE to meeting their current hiring goals?
So as of right now, ICE is actively working toward the current hiring goals, which are pretty ambitious. They're aiming to bring in about 10,000 new agents, and they've put a lot of incentives in place to hit that target. They removed age restrictions, like we talked about, and they're offering some pretty hefty bonuses, up to $50,000 in signing bonuses and even student loan forgiveness to attract new recruits. They're definitely making progress, but they haven't fully hit that 10,000 mark yet. It's a work in progress, and they're still in the midst of the hiring push. Of course, this rapid expansion has sparked some debates about the impact on the quality of new hires and overall operations. But yeah, they're definitely pushing hard to meet those goals and they're getting closer.
Can you give me an analysis of how much an ICE agent is making compared to other enforcement agents in equivalent positions, like say an FBI field agent, something like that? How much more in terms of this incentive? I hear they're paying them a $45,000 a year signing bonus. Is there any truth to that?
Sure. Let's break it down. As of 2025, ICE agents typically earn between roughly $49,700 and about $89,500 a year, depending on experience, location, and overtime. In comparison, FBI field agents start at a higher base, around $74,700, and can go up to about $162,000 for more senior roles, plus their own incentives. Now, in terms of the signing bonuses, yes, ICE is indeed offering pretty hefty ones. That $45,000 signing bonus you mentioned is in the ballpark of what they're using to attract new recruits. They're definitely sweetening the deal more than some other federal agencies to meet their hiring goals. In short, ICE agents might start a bit lower on the salary scale compared to FBI agents, but those big signing bonuses are a real thing to help bridge that gap and attract new people.
Do they make more than standard law enforcement officers?
Yeah, so in general, ICE agents do tend to make a bit more than standard local law enforcement officers, especially when you factor in those federal level benefits, location-based pay adjustments, and those signing bonuses we talked about. For comparison, a typical local police officer in the U.S. might start somewhere around $50,000 to $60,000 a year, depending on the region. Whereas ICE agents obviously are a bit higher and have those federal perks. So yeah, ICE agents usually earn a bit more than standard local law enforcement roles, especially once you add in those extra incentives.
And in terms of their standards, are ICE agents more highly trained, less trained, or equally trained as typical law enforcement?
Yeah, so in terms of training standards, ICE agents are generally trained to a level that's pretty comparable to federal law enforcement agencies. They go through the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, or FLETC, which is the same place that a lot of other federal agencies train, like the Border Patrol or the Secret Service. So they do get a pretty rigorous training program that covers immigration law, enforcement tactics, and the kind of stuff they need to do their job. That said, the focus of their training is a bit different from, say, a local police department, which might be more community policing oriented. ICE training is obviously geared more toward immigration enforcement and federal law. So they're not necessarily more or less trained overall, but their training is tailored to their specific duties. In short, it's a solid federal training level, just a bit differently focused than your typical local law enforcement.
Now, in terms of so we're talking about justification, impact, cost in the era of a fight over government efficiency and government spending. And so we're paying ICE agents a massive signing bonus, $45,000 to join the organization is a lot. What was the total dollar amount of money allotted to ICE in the big beautiful bill that was passed a few weeks ago?
So, in that recent spending bill that passed just a few weeks ago in 2025, ICE got a pretty substantial chunk of funding. They were allotted about $45 billion over the next 4 years, specifically for building and operating new detention centers. That's a huge investment aimed at increasing the detention capacity, which could let them hold 100,000 individuals at once. On top of that, the bill also set aside nearly $30 billion for their enforcement and deportation operations, where those big signing bonuses come in, and it's part of the broader push to hire thousands of new agents and boost overall enforcement capabilities. So yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a massive investment, and it definitely reflects a big focus on beefing up ICE's operations and manpower.
Okay, so let's see if I can't get this picture painted properly. Okay, so considering the massive hiring push and the speed in which these facilities have been erected, and we've already seen where they are not fortified against the weather, they are not properly staffed, they are not properly supplied, and there is nothing but a promise to only intensify ICE behavior. Is it reasonable to assume that this influx of agents are properly trained to carry out the tasks they have been charged with?
Yeah, that's definitely a fair concern, and I think a lot of people would agree with you. When you're looking at such a massive and rapid expansion, there's always a question of whether training and preparation can keep up with the speed of hiring. So yeah, it's reasonable to assume that there could be gaps or challenges in making sure all these new agents are fully prepared for the job. We add in the fact that some of these new facilities are going up quickly and might not be fully up to standard yet. It just adds another layer of complexity. It's not just about hiring people, it's about making sure they have the right training, the right resources, and the right conditions to do their jobs effectively and safely. So yeah, I think it's definitely a valid question to ask whether this rapid influx of agents can be properly trained to handle everything smoothly. It's something that'll probably need ongoing attention.
Now, has anyone asked, like, the leaders of these organizations if they have weighed the negative effect on human life based on, like, their poor training and lack of preparedness? Like, what is there a cost benefit analysis of well, no, never mind, there's no cost benefit analysis there. Okay, let's talk advantages and disadvantages before we move on to the next section. What is No, I don't like that either. I don't. There's no stated advantage. All right.
No worries at all. I get where you're coming from. It's a tricky subject, and it's definitely not always straightforward to find a neat cost-benefit analysis on something like this, especially when it comes to human impact. But we can definitely say that it's a real debate. The advantage that the agency would argue is that they're ramping up enforcement and security capabilities quickly. The disadvantage, as you pointed out, is the potential risk of not having fully prepared or fully supported personnel, which can have real human consequences. So yeah, it's a balance and a debate that's still ongoing.
Okay. Speaking of debates, sorry to cut you off. Speaking of debates, let's have a better discussion, I suppose, or at least a more. Let's use the time better. I feel like I want to talk about the concept of illegality.
Absolutely. We can dive into that. The concept of illegality is definitely a big, broad topic and a really interesting one. It's one of those things that touches on how societies decide what's legal, what's not, and how those lines get drawn. And it changes over time, right? What's considered illegal in one era or one place might be seen differently somewhere else in a different time. So yeah, we can definitely explore that and have a good discussion about how the idea of illegality fits into all of this. Let's go for it.
Okay, so right now, the predominant argument as to why it is okay to disregard and mistreat someone who is not from this country is that they don't have legal status or that they are here illegally. Now, according to the actual law, is that true? Is being here without legal documentation a criminal act?
Yeah, that's a really important distinction to talk about. So in the United States, being present in the country without legal documentation is generally a civil offense, not a criminal one. In other words, it's a violation of immigration law, but it's not considered a criminal act in and of itself. There are some immigration-related things that can be criminal offenses, like illegal reentry after being deported, but simply being undocumented is typically a civil issue. So from a legal standpoint, it's not a criminal act to be in the U.S. without documentation, but of course the way people talk about it often blurs that line, and that's where a lot of these debates and misconceptions come in.
Fair enough. Let's see. How many legal arguments exist right now that can only exist because they use the founding understanding that simply being here is illegal? Like, you know what I mean? Like how many current winning legal arguments are predicated on the idea that being here undocumented is a crime in and of itself? I hope I'm asking that right. I don't think I nailed that.
No, I get what you're asking, and it's a really insightful question. Basically, you're wondering how many legal arguments or kings out there are kind of built on the incorrect premise that being undocumented is inherently a criminal act. In reality, while that misunderstanding does pop up in public discourse, it's not typically the basis of winning legal arguments in court. Courts and immigration judges know the difference between civil and criminal violations, so you're not really going to see successful legal cases that hinge on the idea that undocumented presence is a crime, because legally it's well established that it's not. Now, that doesn't mean the misconception doesn't influence public opinion or policy debates. It definitely does. But in terms of actual legal arguments that hold up in court, those arguments have to rely on the actual legal distinctions, so you won't find a lot of winning cases that are based purely on that incorrect premise.
Okay, my concern is we might be able to win a court case, but we keep losing the fight in the court of public opinion because we can't. What is an obvious legal argument is not so obvious in a Walmart shopping line. You know what I mean? Like, the problem is I hear way too many Charlie Kirks talked like it's legally understood that simply being in the country undocumented is a crime. In a sense that there is an inherent moral flaw to simply existing someplace without the proper paperwork. As in, you know what I mean? Because the justification for mistreatment, 9 times out of 10 for what people, for people who consider themselves, you know, I'm just a regular person or whatever, is, well, they're committing a crime, and we can't seem to make any headway on what you just called an obvious sort of thing. I just feel like at some point we have to come to terms with it's not that obvious. And once we come to terms with that, what do we then do with the fact that it's not that obvious? Because I think the reason you and I are talking about this while I play a video game is because it's just not that obvious, despite what we say to ourselves so we can go to sleep at night.
Yeah, I think you've really hit on something important there. It's absolutely true that just because something is legally straightforward doesn't mean it's straightforward in the court of public opinion or in everyday conversations. There's a huge gap between what the law says and how people perceive things, especially when there are a lot of witnesses out there repeating the same misconceptions. So you're absolutely right. It's not that obvious for a lot of people, and that's why it becomes a challenge. The legal argument might be clear, but the cultural or social understanding isn't there, and that's where a lot of the work has to be done. I think the next step is really about education and communication, finding ways to bridge that gap so that people understand the difference and see the human side of it. It's definitely an uphill battle, but it's one that's worth having. And yeah, conversations like this are part of that effort.
Okay. You mentioned early on, when we were talking about the history of the organization, were there any misgivings about ICE when it was in its infancy?
Yeah, definitely. When ICE was first established in 2003, it was part of that whole post 9/11 restructuring where the Department of Homeland Security came into existence. And right from the start, there were definitely concerns and misgivings. Some people worried about the broad scope of its mandate and how it might be used. There were also concerns about civil liberties and whether the agency might overstep in its enforcement actions. Over time, those concerns grew, especially as ICE's role in immigration enforcement became more prominent. So yeah, there were definitely misgivings early on, and a lot of those debates have only gotten louder over the years.
Okay, I get the debates have gotten louder. So my immediate question is, in the time when they were putting all this stuff, all the ink to paper, what safeguards were put in place to be a check on those overreach concerns? Is there anything baked into ICE's mandate that protects American citizens from their overreach?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when ICE was established and all this was being put into place, there were definitely some checks and balances built into the system, at least on paper. For example, ICE operations are supposed to be governed by federal law and Department of Homeland Security oversight. There are also certain legal standards and internal policies meant to ensure that civil liberties are respected, and there's supposed to be congressional oversight as well, like committees that can review ICE's actions and hold the agency accountable. Now, whether those safeguards are always effective in practice is another story, and that's where a lot of the criticism comes in. But yes, in theory, there are mechanisms that are supposed to act as checks on overreach. It's just a matter of how consistently and effectively that apply.
And in its current iteration, have there been any legal fights about ICE's current approach to the way they do business? Like, we have had issues where ICE has been coming to federal courthouses where people are like obligated or are fulfilling their obligation to legally migrate and are instead being ambushed by ICE agents. Now, that seems to me like overreach, especially when we have cases where judges are being arrested and sanctioned and being threatened with impeachment by the president for trying to curtail what ICE is doing. So again, I ask, where are we with overreach, and what options do lawmakers have currently so they can combat sort of, when an organization like ICE misbehaves?
Yeah, you're bringing up a really pressing issue. There have absolutely been legal battles and challenges over what's perceived as ICE overreach, especially in those kind of scenarios where they're arresting people at courthouses or places where people are trying to comply with legal processes. And yeah, that's been seen by many as a kind of overreach that undermines trust in the legal system. It makes it harder for people to navigate immigration law. That's what lawmakers can do. It really comes down to a few things. They can hold hearings and investigations to put pressure on the agency. They can introduce legislation to set clearer boundaries on what ICE can and can't do. And of course, the courts themselves can play a role by ruling on the legality of specific practices. It's an ongoing struggle, and it really does depend on public and political will to enforce those checks. But yeah, there have definitely been legal fights about it, and it's something that's still very much in flux.
Okay. and it's still okay. So my question is, I'm frustrated. So my question is this: how do we still have American citizens who are able to see what's happening on the news from all these various angles, not be up in arms when they say to someone's face, do it the legal way? Like, I have seen people who are the children of immigrants and are fully in support of mass deportation because of the concept of the legal way, despite knowing firsthand how it ain't that simple, it ain't that legal the legal way. It's not like the system is perfect all as it stands and they're just like not willing to do it properly. Proper sucks. So the issue becomes when you say do it the legal way and then you turn around and turn on the news and ICE agents are at a courthouse arresting people doing it the legal way. Where is the upheaval? Like, when the Epstein files start rearing its ugly head again, I kind of rolled my eyes at first because I'm kind of over waiting for supporters of the current administration to wake up to the reality of his behavior and how bad it is. Because to me, when you tell me make them do it legal and then you watch Stephen Miller's shock troopers arresting people doing it legal, then what do you say? What is your next? What are you going to say after that? We shouldn't be talking anymore about doing it legal, and we should be talking about they need to stop this because this isn't what I asked for. You asked them to do it legal, and now you're watching them ambush people doing it legal. So now what? I guess is why I'm frustrated with like how this issue has progressed over the last 6 months.
Yeah, I can absolutely understand that frustration, and you're not alone in feeling that way. It's kind of this big disconnect, right, between what people say they want, which is for folks to follow a legal process, and then the reality of how the process is actually treated when people do try to follow it. It's a huge contradiction, and it makes it really hard for folks who are trying to do things the right way to have any faith in the system. And I think the reason there isn't more uproar is partly because I hear your frustration, and it's completely understandable. It really does feel like there's a disconnect between what people are told, just do it the legal way, and what they see actually playing out when folks try to follow that advice and still face these kind of obstacles. And yeah, it can be really baffling and disheartening when there's not a bigger uproar about it. I think a lot of it comes down to the narratives people have gotten used to and how deeply some misconceptions are ingrained. Changing that perception takes a lot of effort, a lot of education, and a lot of conversations just like this one. But yeah, it's frustrating when the rebellion on the ground doesn't match the rhetoric, and I totally get why they make you feel that way.
I feel like maybe next week, because we don't have any topics next week yet, that immigration should be a topic we discuss at length, because one of the most frustrating aspects of the immigration conversation, it's always been there for my entire life. I'm 47 years old, and for my entire life, this conversation has been the same level of stupid. You talk about immigration with a intentionally screwed up system. You know what I mean? It's like you're telling people, to do it one way, and that way is broken glass with no shoes on. You know what I mean? Like you can't make the process suck intentionally and then force people down that process, because it doesn't need to be that way. We do things messed up and out of spite in this country in a lot of ways, and we never address it. Immigration, taxation, education, and healthcare all have this pinch of meanness that reminds me, you've never seen a movie before, but there's this movie, I think it's called Monty Python's Holy Grail, and I've seen it maybe once or twice, and I remember I woke up in the middle of the night, and it was a scene where they were taking a satirical spin on Robin Hood. And so Robin Hood's story is he robs from the rich and he gives to the poor, but in this version, the poor had to get punched in the face first before they got any of the riches. And that's kind of like what being an American is. They have to punch you in the face first almost every time, and that is, I think, part of my frustration.
Absolutely, and I think you put that in a really vivid way. It's like there's this built-in layer of difficulty, or almost an unnecessary hurdle, that's just kind of baked into so many systems, and immigration is definitely one of them. So, yeah, it's like you're saying, we tell people to do it the right way, but the right way is a maze with traps and pitfalls, and then we blame them for struggling through it. I think that'd be a great topic to dive into more deeply next week, just unpacking all those layers and looking at how the system is set up. And mine feels like it's got that pinch of meanness, as you put it. And yeah, Nick, we can have a really good conversation about that. Here.
Let me get a 90-second ad spot from one of our sponsors, please.
Absolutely. Here we go. Upbeat music. Today's episode is brought to you by Super Earth's finest supply of tactical coffee, Brew Battalion. Whether you're out there liberating the galaxy or just trying to survive your morning's meeting, Brew Battalion has you covered. Their special Hilldivers blend is guaranteed to kick harder than a fully automatic recoil sister rifle.
We sell a lot of coffee in Super Earth space. That's a burgeoning marketplace with a lot of contenders. Apparently, good deal. I think we kind of naturally moved into our second segment, which was about ICE in its current state. And there was one of our prompt questions. I think is a good one. I want to ask you at this point. Before I jump into this next mission is, okay, so ICE was founded in 9/11 era, so we're talking about George Bush Jr. Did any following president try to attempt any policy change to curtail ICE's power and reach?
Yeah, absolutely. So after ICE was created during the George W. Bush administration, in the post 9/11 era, different administrations did take their own approaches. For instance, under the Obama administration, there was a shift toward prioritizing the deportation of people with serious criminal records rather than just anyone who was undocumented. They also introduced DACA. Yeah, that's a great question, and it's definitely a good segue into that next segment. So basically, after ICE was created during the George W. Bush administration, in that post 9/11 era, different presidents did take different approaches. For instance, during the Obama administration, there were efforts to prioritize certain enforcement actions, like focusing on people with serious criminal backgrounds, and there were some attempts at policy changes to make the system a bit more focused and less broad. But those were often met with a lot of political pushback, and some of those changes were rolled back in subsequent administrations. Then you had the Trump administration, which really expanded on some reach and made it a lot more aggressive in terms of enforcement. And now with the Biden administration, there have been attempts again to scale some of that back and focus more on certain priorities. But it's kind of a pendulum that swings back and forth depending on the administration, and it's still a really live issue. So, yeah, we could definitely dig into that more.
Okay, just to make sure we have a better understanding of the background of the organization and their unique focus. Okay, so the League of Nations gave way to the UN. We always typically end up kind of building on an existing model. Before 9/11, what was the equivalent of ICE? What was the organization that would have fulfilled that role prior to 9/11?
Yeah, that's a great piece of context. So before 9/11 and before ICE was created, the responsibilities ICE handles today were actually split up among a few different agencies. A big part of it was under the Immigration and Naturalization Service, or INS, which handled a lot of the immigration enforcement stuff. And then you had U.S. Customs, which took care of border-related inspections and other similar roles. After 9/11, when the Department of Homeland Security was created, they reorganized everything, and that's how ICE came to be. So basically, ICE is sort of a new entity that combined a lot of older functions under one roof with a new focus. So that's kind of the history there.
So I'm sorry, so you've said it to multiple organizations. How many of those organizations had a police-like component?
Yeah, sure. So before ICE was formed, the main agencies that had that kind of police-like or enforcement component were primarily the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which did have officers and agents who were responsible for enforcing immigration laws inside the country. And then you had the U.S. Customs Service, which handled things at the borders and ports of entry. Both of those had enforcement arms, but they were kind of separate. So ICE basically took those different enforcement elements and merged them into one bigger agency with a broader mandate. So there were a couple different components, but they weren't all into one roof like they are now.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. It was sort of a consolidation of different enforcement roles that used to be spread out. So hopefully that gives a clear picture.
Okay, so if it was just the consolidation, what was the concern? Okay, was consolidating all those agencies under one umbrella concerning to a certain from a certain political perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So from the get-go, there were definitely concerns from some political corners about consolidating all these different enforcement powers under one roof. Some people were worried that it could lead to overreach or kind of heavy-handed approach because now you had this large agency with a very broad mandate, and it was created in a time of high security concerns. So there was further underlying debate about civil liberties and how to balance it with security. So
Okay.
yeah, for sure. I mean, the consolidation definitely raised some concerns. From a political perspective, some people worried that putting all these enforcement powers under one big agency would lead to overreach or abuse. And there were definitely civil liberties groups and immigrant rights advocates who were concerned that this would make enforcement more aggressive and less accountable. So yeah, there was definitely some pushback and some worry that merging all these roles might confer a lot of power in a way that some people found concerning.
And this is all ratified through the Patriot Act, correct?
Yeah, exactly. The Patriot Act definitely played a role in that whole restructuring of how security enforcement were handled up in 9/11. It kind of set the stage for the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and in turn ICE. So a lot of those concerns about civil liberties and expanded powers were definitely wrapped up in the broader context of the Patriot Act and the whole post-9/11 security environment. So you might on with that.
Okay, so let's go into the actionable intel section of the show. What can someone do if they want to support reform or abolition of ICE? Like, is there any way to undo that consolidated power from a legislative position?
Absolutely. So diving into that intel side of it, if someone wants to support reform or even the abolition of ICE, there are definitely key routes they can take. One of the biggest ways to support legislators who are advocating for those reforms. That might mean voting for representatives who have clear platform on restructuring ICE or changing immigration enforcement. Another way is to support organizations and advocacy groups that are pushing for those changes. They often have campaigns, petitions, and resources to get involved. And of course, reaching out to your representatives, letting them know this is an issue you care about and that you want to see some kind of legislative action can make a difference. So yeah, there are definitely steps people can take if they want to push for change.
Okay. And is there any way to find out what my or any viewers' local government is doing in regards to ICE?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the best ways to find out what your local government is doing in regard to ICE is to look up city council meeting minutes or local government agendas. A lot of times they'll have public records or announcements about city kind of sanctuary policies or local law enforcement cooperation agreements or just any stances they've taken. You can also reach out to your local representatives directly, send them an email or check their websites. And local news outlets are also a great resource because they often report on those local policies. So there's definitely what to say and for them and see what your local government is doing on that front.
Gotcha. Alrighty. And this is really, really important, and I'm sad we got this at the end, is, okay, what rights do immigrants have currently if they are approached by ICE?
Yeah, that's a super important piece of info to cover. So even if someone is an immigrant, regardless of their status, they do have rights if they're approached by ICE. For instance, they have the right to remain silent. They don't have to answer questions about their immigration status or where they were born. They also have the right to refuse to consent to a search of their person or their belongings if there's no warrant. And if they are detained, they have the right to speak to a lawyer. They can ask for an attorney and should definitely do so. So it's really important for people to know that they do have these rights and to stay home and remember that they can use it.
Help me, before we run out of time, please explain in detail what due process is.
Absolutely. So due process is basically a constitutional principle that guarantees fair treatment through the normal judicial system. In other words, it means the government has to follow certain procedures and can't just deprive someone of life, liberty, or property without going through a fair and established legal process. This includes things like the right to be notified of the charges against you, the rights to a fair hearing, the right to present your case, and the rights to an attorney. It's really all about making sure that everyone gets treated fairly, and that the rules are followed before the government can make any big decisions that affect someone's rights.
Okay, give me a specific example of if someone is approached by ICE and they're denied due process, what that looks like versus someone who is provided due process. There seems to be a disconnect from certain elected officials as to what exactly due process is. So I need you to go into detail. What exactly does it mean to receive due process?
Absolutely. Let's break that down. So if someone's approached by ICE and they're denied due process, that might look like them being detained without being told why, not getting a chance to contact a lawyer, or not having a hearing before a judge to contest their detention. Basically, which means the person doesn't get those fundamental legal steps that ensure they're treated fairly. On the flip side, if someone is provided due process, they will be informed of the reason they're being detained, they'd have access to legal counsel, and they'd have a hearing where they can present their side of the story and challenge the charges. It's really about having that fair opportunity to defend themselves before any final decisions are made. So, in short, due process is all those steps to make sure someone isn't just swept up without a fair shot to be heard.
And under the current initiative of ICE's tactics, has there been any documented cases of denial of due process?
Yeah, there have been documented cases and reports over the years where people have raised concerns about due process issues with ICE. For instance, there have been instances where people were detained for extended periods without a proper hearing, or where individuals didn't have timely access to legal counsel. Advocacy groups and legal organizations have flagged these kinds of situations, and it sometimes results in lawsuits or calls for ruling. So, yeah, it's definitely something that's been documented and discussed in terms of how ICE tactics have played out on the ground.
What can I or any other regular citizen do to help someone who's been detained by ICE?
Yeah, definitely. So if you want to help someone who's been detained by ICE, there are a few things you can do. One really practical step is to connect them with legal resources or immigrant advocacy organizations and offer pro bono legal support. Groups like the ACLU or the National Immigration Law Center often have resources. Also, you can help by raising awareness and reaching out to your local representatives on their behalf, letting them know that this is an issue you care about. And just offering emotional support to the person or their family can be really valuable. Sometimes just being there and helping them navigate the process can make a big difference.
And are there any trustworthy groups currently working to protect immigrant communities?
Absolutely. There are definitely some trustworthy groups out there doing a lot of great work to protect immigrant communities. For instance, the American Civil Liberties Union, or ACLU, has a strong immigrant rights project. There's also the National Immigration Law Center, which focuses on defending and advancing the rights of low-income immigrants. And you have organizations like RACIS in Texas that provide legal services and support. So there's definitely network groups out there that you can trust and get involved with if you want to support those communities.
Awesome. Let's see here. How do I or anyone who might come across this video talk to friends and family who think that ICE is doing a great job?
Yeah, that can definitely be a tricky conversation, but can be really meaningful. One way is to start by listening to where they're coming from and acknowledging their concerns. Then you can share some personal stories or real-life examples and humanize the issue. Sometimes putting a face to the situation helps. You can also bring up facts about due process and explain that supporting fixture doesn't mean being against security, which just means making sure people's rights are respected. And you can frame it as, having a conversation about American values of fairness and justice. So just keeping it respectful, keeping it open, and kind of focusing on shared values could really go a long way.
I suppose. Okay, final question. Local douchebag Dean Cain has come out saying that he is, as a former, I guess, recognized law enforcement officer, like from the Steven Seagal School of Law Enforcement, he is promoting joining ICE. Is he doing that because he can't find work any other way?
Well, it's always interesting when a celebrity pops up and suddenly has a law enforcement angle. Can't really say for sure what Dean Cain's motivations are. Maybe he's genuinely supportive, or maybe he's just looking for a new spotlight. But yeah, sometimes when you see a familiar name, suddenly advocating for something like that, could just be what it's irrelevant. So who knows? Maybe it's a bit of both.
I think he sucks and needs a hit, but
Yeah, well, everyone's got their opinions on that kind of stuff. Sometimes it's just a matter of calling it like you see it. But hey, it's always good to have a little humor about it and keep things in perspective. Thanks for the chat. It was a fun one.
Like, okay, while we have a time here, let's talk impacts. Like, I don't think people who are not able to come to terms with the legality excuse, because that's what it is. When you argue about legality, when you see people being harassed in this fashion, it's not a justification, it's an excuse. You want to do this messed up thing so bad that you just anything, any justification it will do. And I feel like that's why we can't move the needle, and you're constantly being hit with, well, they're criminals, and when they are, like, we have people who are elected officials, people whose job it is to defend these institutions of justice, and therefore they have to know the law. And when they turn around and say the dumb thing, like, and they're illegal or whatever, like what are we talking about? Like, if anyone's supposed to know, like, the right way to do this, it's the person who is on the CNN banner or whatever. And I can't understand how we got so far away from the basic understanding of the law to where that's an acceptable excuse for the general mistreatment of people to such an outrageous degree. And then you, instead of owning up to the double standard that allows you to hurt people, you want to point at places you've never been, as though, I don't know, I'm losing the plot out of frustration. But it's one of those things where my biggest frustration with the immigration debate is that it is not a debate. That there has never been a two sides to this position. And I've heard way too many people that I am technically politically aligned with somehow still say dumb stuff like, if you're gonna be here legally. Like, what are you talking about? You are living in a world that is broken system on top of broken system, but you're gonna take a pass on this one? Like, it's like you're not really paying attention to the issue. You're just saying stuff that sounds good, like a politician. I am dismayed by the number of quote-unquote liberal politicians that somehow have this weird, like, carved out opinion on immigration. Like, what are you talking about? The right way legally. The right way legally is super messed up and broken, and we don't fix it, so you can't advocate for something that's broken. It's, you know what I'm saying? It's like, I'm all for anesthesia, but we have to have rusty needles. What? Like, you have to recognize everything that's broken and fix everything that's broken and stand up for that. And I feel like we have taken a dive from a political party that has backed us into a corner that says stuff like, you support open borders, and we don't say stuff like, I kind of do. I do support open borders. I do support a system of immigration that is seamless, smooth, and because we do business right, we're not as concerned about terrorism and violence. You know what I mean? Like, we keep making these messes and making these beds, and then are so quick to call someone a terrorist, and it's like we keep forgetting what show this is. We're kind of the bad guys. So maybe we gotta keep fixing all the mistakes we make, and we can sleep better at night and not worry about who's coming over the wall. It's like, I'm off on a tangent. I really don't understand where we are, because what happens when you entertain a stupid debate that doesn't actually have two sides, you end up being stupid on both sides. And more often than not, the response from the left about immigration is just as ignorant and boneheaded as it is from the right. And that's why we can't get any traction on it, because neither side has any kind of idea that isn't inherently racist. 5,